What I'm showing you here is how to draw a basic neural pathway. We're going to learn how to draw a basic sensory pathway and a basic motor pathway. So let me orient you as to the anatomy that you're seeing here. This is the brain and this is the spinal cord. I did not draw it to proportion. This is the cerebral cortex I've labeled here. So this whole outer region of the brain, of the cerebrum, is gray matter. Remember, what's significant about gray matter is that's where we find cell bodies and dendrites and unmyelinated axons. It's in gray matter that synapsis takes place, and that's important. The thalamus is also gray matter, although I'm not going to color that in. But gray matter here, thalamus is gray matter. Remember, the thalamus's job is to serve as a relay station to the cerebral cortex. So it's going to route the pathway to the appropriate region on the cerebral cortex for discrimination. This is representing the cerebellum. This is representing the medulla oblongata. Remember, the medulla oblongata is where we have the decussation of pyramids. It's where fibers cross over from one side of the brain to the next in motor pathways. Here we have the spinal cord, and I've tried to separate the gray from the white matter. So the gray matter is on the inside of the dotted lines, and the white matter would be the material on the outside. The white matter, remember, is divided into columns or funiculi. Then we have our spinal nerve. That's a spinal nerve. This is a spinal nerve. Spinal nerves are paired, and they are also mixed, meaning they contain both motor and sensory pathways. This is the dorsal root, this is the ventral root, and the dorsal root ganglion. So now we're going to look at a basic sensory pathway. I always like to use blue for sensory. So in a sensory pathway, we begin at a receptor. So a big R for receptor, and that could be in the foot or the hand or wherever. It's going to pick up a stimulus, and an action potential is going to fire along this axon that I'm drawing. Now, this first neuron is a unipolar neuron, and its cell body is housed in the dorsal root ganglion. That's always the way it's going to be. So it's our first sensory neuron, unipolar, cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. It continues in and will stop in the gray matter. That's important. You want it to stop in the gray matter because it's going to synapse with our second neuron. Sensory pathways, basic sensory pathways, have 3 neurons. So this first neuron can also be called a first order neuron because it's the first one. It's going to synapse with a second order neuron, which is multipolar, whose cell body is in the gray matter. There's a synapse that will occur there, which is important, so I want to write that down. Synapses always occur in gray matter. Synapses occur in gray matter. So that's where you want to always draw your cell bodies. Now the axon of the second order neuron is going to enter the white matter and travel up to the brain, and that's also important. Axons always travel in white matter. I'm going to go ahead and have it cross over here at the medulla, and it will stop at the thalamus. So that's important as well. Most sensory pathways will stop at the thalamus, and the thalamus will do 2 things. The thalamus will discriminate, is that pleasant or unpleasant, and then it will decide where out here on the cortex does this pathway need to go in order to discriminate what kind of stimulus was detected here at the receptor. So there's going to be a second synapse with a third order neuron whose cell body is multipolar, and it will send it to the appropriate place for discrimination. So that is a basic sensory pathway. It involved 3 neurons. Here's our first order neuron, our second order neuron, our third order neuron. It would also be considered an ascending pathway because the information is going up to the brain, ascending. And the name of that pathway, it's this track right there, because remember, tracks, we call nerves, bundles of axons in the central nervous system we call tracks. So that is the spinothalamic tract based on its origin and termination. So that blue track I just drew is the spinothalamic tract. It's sensory, it's ascending. So now we're going to quick sketch out a motor pathway. So our motor pathway, I like to use red, and the motor pathway is always going to begin in the brain and go down. We're going to begin in the cerebral cortex with a first order neuron that has a multipolar cell body located there in the gray matter. We always draw cell bodies in the gray matter. The axon is going to pass down through the brain. It does not stop at the thalamus. The thalamus is only for sensory things, not motor. So the axon of that motor neuron is going to pass down through the brain, and then it's going to cross over or decussate at the medulla, at what we call the decussation of pyramids. It will continue down the white matter of the spinal cord, and then it will enter the gray so it can synapse with the second order neuron. There are only 2 neurons in our basic motor pathway. So this is the first order neuron here. The second order neuron will have a multipolar cell body in the gray matter. Its axon will leave the ventral root into the spinal nerve and out to an effector. Since it's motor, that's going to be a skeletal muscle. So the information's going down. It's going from the brain down. So it's a descending pathway. It began in the cerebral cortex, ends in the spinal cord. So this is called a corticospinal tract. Corticospinal. It is motor, and it is descending. And it only had 2 neurons, and it crossed over the medulla. That's how you draw your basic neural pathways.